Chapter 27, Early Days of the Cold War. So we're going back to right after World War II ended and the future of post-war Europe. And a group of the Allied leaders met right before the war ended, something called the Yalta Conference, and they were met to discuss Europe's future. And they supported the formation of an international peacekeeping organization and agreed on free elections for countries liberated from Germany. At the Potsdam Conference, the second conference, this was after the war ended, the Allied leaders decided to divide the conquered Germany and the capital, Berlin, into 4 zones, each controlled by one of the Allied countries. In 1944, the United Nations was created after the Yalta Conference, and the charter started in 1945. It was dedicated to resolving international conflicts. One of the first major actions that the United Nations did was to divide the Palestine land into 2 separate places, an Arab and a Jewish state. After World War II, Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, established communist governments in Poland and much of Eastern Europe, and then decided to cut them off from the rest of the world, which became symbolically known as the Iron Curtain. So if you're looking at the map, the Soviet Union invaded all these places and established communist governments on these areas. And this is kind of the imaginary Iron Curtain that separates East Europe from the Western part. The phrase Cold War, which then begins, came to be used to describe the struggle for global power between the Soviet Union and the United States. The U.S. goal was containment, or preventing the Soviet Union from expanding its influence around the world. The Truman Doctrine was a policy providing aid to help any foreign country who was trying to fight the spread of communism. As you can see in this newspaper article, there was issues in Greece and Turkey with communism, and the United States wanted to give aid to those countries. The Marshall Plan was for Western Europe to receive more than $13 billion in U.S. loans and grants for European economic recovery between 1948 and 1952. They didn't want to repeat of World War I, where those countries who were suffering after the war turned to those totalitarian governments. So this was to kind of stop the spread of communism, if you will. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, was established, and it was a coalition of the United States, 9 Western European countries, Canada, and Iceland that formed to defend each other in case of an attack by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union responded by creating the Warsaw Pact. It was kind of an allegiance of all the communist countries. Then you have the Berlin Airlift, which you see here, which the United States and some allies were dropping supplies to the kind of communist sections of Berlin, or at least to the, I shouldn't say communist, but to Berlin, because we couldn't get into Berlin to give them aid. And so we dropped supplies in Berlin. The Korean War, well, we're going to talk about the Korean War next. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was established by communists, led by a man named Mao Zedong, who you see here. After World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel with a Soviet-implemented government in the north and a U.S.-implemented government in the south. Here's the 38th parallel, divided those 2 countries. North would be communist, south would be democracy. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea will invade South Korea. So, looking at our little map here, the North will invade the South. And they will push all the way down to close to the bottom of South Korea. The United States and the United Nations responded by offering support to South Korea and China supported North Korea. So it was a United Nations-led effort in this war. It wasn't a United States war, though the majority of the UN troops were American. By 1951, the United Nations forces drove the North Koreans and Chinese back across the 38th parallel, but fighting continued. So North Korea got all the way down here, but then the United States the United Nations then pushed back and got almost up to the border of China. The unpopularity of Truman's actions during this war, including firing Douglas MacArthur, helped Dwight Eisenhower win the 1952 presidential election. And the Korean War ended with a ceasefire on July 27, 1953. When I say it ended, officially it really hasn't ended. The ceasefire just means we just stopped fighting. So even today, along the border of that 48th parallel, or the 38th parallel, you have North Koreans with their guns aimed in the south, and South Koreans and Americans aiming their weapons at the north. A congressional committee known as the House Un-American Activities Committee was in charge of investigating communist influence in America. In 1947, HUAC launched hearings to expose supposed communist influence in the movie industry, which denied many actors work, or directors and such. They were what they called blackballed, because if someone labeled you a communist, you wouldn't find work anymore in Hollywood. Explosive spy cases also fed fears that communists were at work in the United States, like the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg case, who were convicted and executed for selling secrets to the Soviets. That's them right there. In 1950, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy charged that communists were working inside the State Department, meaning the Secretary of State's department. In 1954, during a televised hearing, Joseph McCarthy finally went too far and accused the Army, the United States Army, of having communists in it. And because he acted like that on television, people thought the guy was crazy. And later, the United States Senate voted to condemn Joseph McCarthy's actions, and they censored him. By 1953, an arms race developed between the United States and Soviet Union, like who can amass the most nuclear weapons. In October of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial space satellite. And then in January of 1958, the United States established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, to compete with the Soviet Union to get to space and be the first person to land on the moon. That is the end of Chapter 27.